Bruce Lee was challenged by a famous fighter. 15 seconds later, the fight scene was unbelievable. The fight did not last long enough for most people to understand what they had seen. Years later, the challenger would still describe the moment with hesitation, as if clarity had never fully returned. There was no dramatic exchange, no visible struggle. Only a brief movement, a sudden stillness, and a room full of witnesses realizing something irreversible had just happened. Hong Kong in the mid-1960s carried a rhythm few outsiders noticed. Streets hummed with commerce, but in the narrow alleys and quiet courtyards, a different pulse persisted, one defined by discipline, observation, and the quiet measure of human skill. Martial arts were not merely entertainment. They were proof, ritualized and public, of personal mastery. The gathering place that afternoon was modest, almost ordinary. A studio tucked between shops, its floor worn smooth by decades of practice. Yet, for those who knew, the air itself seemed charged. Witnesses recall the subtle tension, a murmur of expectation that did not need to be spoken aloud. People had come not for spectacle, but to observe certainty manifest in movement. The challenger had arrived earlier, as if drawn by rumor and reputation. His name carried weight, his skill was recognized in several circles, and his confidence was tangible. He moved through the room with deliberate awareness, nodding politely but firmly to those around him. Each gesture was measured, yet there was an energy that hinted at dominance, not a guarantee of victory, but an assumption that the outcome could favor him. Then Bruce appeared. There was no fanfare, no display of readiness. He stepped lightly onto the worn floor, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm, observing the room as much as the man who had come to challenge him. Witnesses later emphasized this. It was not intimidation, nor was it performance. It was a quiet assertion of presence, one that subtly shifted the energy of the room without a single word. The contrast was immediate. One man radiated expectation, visible, almost heavy. The other radiated certainty, intangible yet perceptible to everyone present. People described feeling a subtle shift in the air, a pause in ordinary perception, as though the room itself had acknowledged the arrival of something singular. No one spoke. There was no call for attention, no signal to begin. The atmosphere alone conveyed the stakes. Each observer understood, without instruction, that they were about to witness not a contest of brute force, but a demonstration of absolute mastery. The expectation was set, and the inevitability of the outcome had quietly established itself before a single movement had occurred. Even before any engagement, Bruce's presence dictated the rhythm. Witnesses would later reflect on this. The sense that time itself slowed, that each heartbeat, each breath, counted in the anticipation of the demonstration. It was not suspense that gripped the room. It was the calm, almost clinical certainty that one man's skill would quietly, irreversibly assert itself. The environment, the figures, and the subtle social choreography of observers and participants created a crucible. In that moment, the stage was not prepared with barriers or lights, but with human attention and silent expectation. And in such a space, mastery does not announce itself with noise. It manifests in the inevitability of what is about to occur. The room held its breath. The challenger, confident yet untested against this particular presence, felt the weight of quiet authority pressing in without resistance. Bruce did not move beyond observation. He did not prepare theatrically. He simply existed within the space, and in doing so, declared the rules of engagement without uttering a single sound. Witnesses recall glances exchanged, almost imperceptible, recognition passing from one to another. The arena, ordinary to the untrained eye, had become a lens through which skill, patience, and psychological control could be observed. Every element, the worn floor, the positioning of spectators, the measured breaths of the challenger, contributed to a stage where inevitability was the only certainty. This was not hype. There were no dramatic gestures. There was only quiet presence, measured expectation, and the slow, deliberate shaping of an environment where skill alone would speak. The arena of expectation had been set, and in that stillness, the story of what was about to unfold was already written. The calm momentum is established. The challenger moved with intention, each step deliberate, as if the room itself were a reflection of his skill. Observers noted the precision in his stance, the way his weight shifted subtly, preparing for the engagement he assumed would define the afternoon. His reputation had preceded him. He was confident, measured, and certain that the moment would confirm his authority. Bruce, in contrast, remained still, not because he was passive, but because he had already begun the work of observation, registering every nuance of the room, every micro-movement of the challenger, and every shifting glance of the witnesses. His composure was not performative. It was absolute. Witnesses later described an almost imperceptible energy, a quiet command that did not speak but was understood. When they faced each other, there was no verbal exchange. The air between them carried all necessary information. The challenger's eyes flicked once, briefly, trying to gauge Bruce's readiness. Bruce's gaze was calm, unhurried, and precise. To those present, it was a conversation of skill and presence rather than words. One man measured the space with confidence, the other asserted authority without motion. Small details dominated the observer's memories. The positioning of their feet, the subtle alignment of shoulders, the faint inhalations, synchronized with micro-adjustments of balance. Every movement, however minor, carried weight. Here, authority was not claimed by loud gestures or theatrical displays. It was recognized through clarity, restraint, and absolute confidence in one's own skill. The challenger, accustomed to recognition and compliance from most who faced him, began to register the quiet challenge. His stance, previously assured, began to shift almost imperceptibly. Witnesses described this as a moment when the first cracks appeared, not in arrogance, but in the subtle understanding that he was facing someone whose mastery was measured in seconds, yet whose presence dominated the room entirely. Bruce did not intervene, did not advance, did not signal. His authority was a stillness so complete that the challenger's momentum, both physical and psychological, began to falter. The room itself responded. Spectators leaned in slightly, unconsciously acknowledging the invisible hierarchy. Confidence, once assumed by the challenger, was now being quietly absorbed, reshaped, and, in the most subtle way, displaced. There was no rush, no flourish, and no immediate movement to mark dominance. Yet, in the span of a few minutes, the balance had shifted. Bruce's mastery was not announced. It was recognized. Every breath, every glance, every shift in weight told a story that the challenger could not yet counter. Witnesses recall thinking, even in that brief window, that the outcome was no longer uncertain. The eventuality had quietly, undeniably settled in the room. The chapter closes with a subtle tension. Authority had been established not through challenge or aggression, but through silent mastery. The challenger's confidence, once unshakable, now bore the first signs of doubt. Observers understood, without witnessing a single strike, that the forthcoming demonstration would not merely test skill. It would redefine the perception of mastery itself. The stage for the public tension and psychological drama is now fully set. Word of the confrontation had already spread beyond the walls of the studio. By the time the crowd began to gather, it was not curiosity that drew them, but a subtle, almost magnetic awareness that something extraordinary was unfolding. Witnesses later recalled arriving with ordinary expectations, only to sense an atmosphere charged with quiet inevitability. The energy was not loud. It was precise, contained, and unmistakably taut. Onlookers assembled slowly, forming a semicircle around the two men. There were no chairs, no formal staging, just bodies leaning slightly forward, a collective intake of breath that acknowledged the imminence of a demonstration. No one shouted, no one gestured. The tension existed in the silence, in the way heads turned in unison, in the slight tightening of shoulders and the brief, almost imperceptible shifts of weight. The challenger, now aware that the room was no longer just his stage, adjusted his stance. Confidence remained, but it was tempered by the growing recognition that the witness's attention was not entirely on him. Every eye in the room was quietly measuring, cataloging, anticipating. The public's gaze had become a variable in the unfolding equation, one that neither man needed to command, yet both felt. Bruce, still calm, did not acknowledge the crowd. He did not accelerate the moment, nor did he seek to impress. His focus remained singular, inward and precise, yet outwardly unchanging. Witnesses describe a strange duality. He was both part of the environment and apart from it, as though the room had slowed around him, giving him space to exert influence without motion. Subtle cues dominated the tension. The way the challenger shifted his gaze, scanning the room, scanning Bruce. The almost imperceptible pause in breathing, the twitch of a muscle, the fleeting tension in a wrist. Every movement carried meaning, yet nothing was announced with words or spectacle. It was a silent negotiation, a test conducted entirely through presence, observation, and the psychological weight of awareness. The observers themselves became participants. Some later admitted feeling an odd responsibility, as if their attention could tip the balance even slightly. There was no cheering, no shouting, only a quiet, almost reverent expectation. Witnesses recall a sense of time elongating, a fraction of a second stretching into something that felt enduring. The public edge was not entertainment. It was an acute awareness that mastery, once revealed, could not be ignored. As the moments accumulated, the challenger's initial certainty began to waver. Not in overt panic, but in micro-movements. A shifting weight, a hesitated adjustment, a slight rise in tension along his shoulders. The realization began to crystallize. The public's attention amplified the authority Bruce had quietly asserted. Confidence, previously a constant, now felt fragile under the gaze of an attentive room. The chapter closes on a charged quiet. The room has become an arena not defined by physical confrontation but by perception and awareness. Every witness knows something decisive is about to happen. The challenge is no longer a contest of skill alone. It is a demonstration of psychological dominance, built on restraint, observation, and the inevitability of quiet mastery. The public tension is fully established, setting the stage for the silent, decisive demonstration. The moment arrived without fanfare. There was no signal, no call to action. Witnesses describe it as a shift so subtle, it almost passed unnoticed until it was over. Bruce moved. Not with flourish, not with aggression, not with the performance expected by most observers. His motions were minimal, deliberate, and entirely efficient. The challenger reacted instinctively, as anyone would, drawing on years of training and confidence. But Bruce's movement was not merely faster or stronger. It was precise, complete, and absolute. In the span of what felt like 15 seconds, the demonstration was concluded. Witnesses later struggled to recount the sequence, because so little had happened, and yet everything had been resolved. There were no strikes that echoed, no dramatic grappling. The outcome was decided in the quiet logic of motion, a single alignment of timing, leverage, and judgment. Observers recall a collective pause, a moment of disbelief. The demonstration did not seek applause. It did not ask for recognition. It was an act of mastery distilled to its essence. Every detail, from foot placement to subtle shifts of balance, was executed with a restraint that magnified its effect. The room itself seemed to acknowledge the inevitability of what had occurred. The challenger's reaction was instructive. Confidence gave way to hesitation, hesitation to uncertainty, and uncertainty to an immediate, silent comprehension of defeat. No words were exchanged. No dramatic fall marked the end. Witnesses later described the scene as a reversal so quiet, so absolute, that it unsettled the natural assumptions of all who were present. One moment the challenger was poised. The next, the room had quietly shifted. Authority was no longer contested. Bruce did not linger. He did not repeat, did not over-explain, did not acknowledge the room. His presence remained calm, measured, as if the event had been a single, necessary punctuation in the continuum of his practice. The effect was not intimidation, but clarity. Skill could assert itself without spectacle, and mastery did not require words. Observers would later emphasize the psychological dimension. The demonstration was not merely about physical ability. It was a study in perception, in control, and in timing. The challenger's collapse, imperceptible to the untrained eye at first, became unmistakable in retrospect. A man who relied on expectation now confronted the quiet authority of someone whose movements left no space for assumption. Witnesses also recall a paradoxical sense of awe. The act was brief, almost invisible, and yet the impact was enduring. Silence in this context carried weight. The room had not erupted. It had absorbed. Every detail, the spacing, the measured breaths, the absence of excess, contributed to the lesson, which no one could unsee, and which needed no explanation. By the end of the demonstration, the room had shifted irrevocably. Authority was clear, the challenger's confidence had been neutralized, and observers understood something profound. Mastery does not require spectacle. It asserts itself in the stillness between movements, in the inevitability of timing, in the quiet but undeniable dominance of skill applied without hesitation. The chapter closes with that quiet momentum. There is no applause, no dramatic climax, only the room settling into a recognition that what had just occurred was complete. The stage is set for the final unraveling, the psychological collapse that will transform a moment of skill into a lasting lesson. The moment after the demonstration was almost imperceptible. The challenger did not collapse physically. He did not stumble or shout. Instead, the shift occurred in subtler ways, in the tightening of his shoulders, the slight retreat of his weight, the hesitation in movements that had once been automatic. Observers later described it as watching certainty quietly dissolve, almost in slow motion. For those present, the effect was profound precisely because it was so understated. There was no spectacle of defeat, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, a man who had entered the room radiating confidence now wrestled silently with the realization that his assumptions had been invalidated. His training, his reputation, his expectation of dominance, all were rendered inconsequential in the presence of absolute mastery. Witnesses noted the small gestures. A brief blink, a half step back, a hand brushing a knee as though to steady himself. Each was a signal, not of physical compromise, but of mental recalibration. The psychological collapse had already begun before anyone could articulate it. The challenge was no longer about strength, skill, or technique. It was about recognition of authority, of inevitability, and of a presence that demanded acknowledgement without coercion. Bruce did not press further. There was no exploitation of hesitation, no follow-up strike or motion to emphasize dominance. His role in the room was complete. The power lay not in aggression but in the certainty of execution and the quiet reshaping of perception. Witnesses recall that in those seconds, the room collectively felt the weight of that authority. The challenger, once poised to assert himself, now existed in the shadow of clarity, a clarity that neither needed explanation nor demanded applause. The observers' reactions mirrored the shift. Breaths slowed. Bodies leaned subtly forward as if to lean into the understanding of what had transpired. Conversation ceased. Eyes met briefly, confirming an unspoken agreement. They had witnessed mastery. The psychological collapse was not humiliation. It was the instant comprehension that skill, when executed with restraint and precision, carries consequences far beyond the physical act itself. Some witnesses later described a strange paradox. The room remained silent, almost reverent, yet charged with understanding. What had been expected to be a contest became a demonstration of hierarchy that was absolute and irreversible. The challenger's internal struggle, the realization of being unseated without drama, without noise, lingered in the space longer than any movement ever could. By the end of this quiet unraveling, the lesson was embedded. Mastery had asserted itself not through aggression but through inevitability. The challenger's collapse was psychological, immediate, and total, leaving no question in the minds of those who had gathered. Skill, when coupled with calm authority, does not merely defeat. It recalibrates perception. The chapter closes with the room still. The air holds a tension that is no longer about anticipation but about comprehension. Everyone present, from the challenger to the silent witnesses, understands that something irreversible has occurred. This is the point where skill transcends performance, where authority exists quietly yet undeniably, and where the legacy of what was witnessed begins to take root. Years later, the story circulated quietly, never exaggerated, always told by those who had been present. Each retelling preserved the same details: the briefness of the encounter, the minimal movement, the silent authority that had so completely reframed the room. Bruce's demonstration did not grow in spectacle with time. It only gained clarity, as witnesses reflected on the inevitability they had observed. The challenger, once a figure of unquestioned confidence, became a reference point for the lesson rather than a cautionary tale of defeat. Those who knew him well emphasized that the moment had left no bitterness, only an enduring recognition of mastery. In private, he would describe the experience not as humiliation, but as a revelation. Skill, when distilled to its essence, renders assumptions irrelevant. For the wider martial arts community, the incident became legend not for violence, but for demonstration. Bruce's philosophy, efficiency, humility, and control, was embedded in every retelling, visible in the way he had moved, in the restraint he had exercised, and in the silent recalibration of authority he had imposed. It was a lesson in psychological dominance, not aggression, in clarity, not spectacle, in teaching, not triumph. Those who practiced under his influence spoke of the impact on their understanding of skill. It was no longer enough to strike or to block. Mastery was recognized in stillness, in presence, and in the quiet but undeniable assertion of certainty. The fight, brief as it had been, became a reference point, a moment where observation alone could teach more than hours of instruction. Witnesses noted, years later, that the memory lingered not as an exciting story but as a quiet benchmark. The room, the air, the precise movements, all remained vivid in recollection. The incident shaped careers, informed training methods, and influenced students who had never been present, yet who learned through retelling the way authority could be asserted with minimal motion. Bruce himself did not speak of the encounter publicly. The legacy was in the observer's memories, in the silent testimony of a demonstration that had no need for repetition. It endured because it was true, efficient, and complete. There were no embellishments, no dramatics, only a sequence of choices that left a permanent imprint on those who had the clarity to witness it. The final impression is quiet, reflective, almost reverent. The challenger, the spectators, the martial arts world at large, all were changed by a brief encounter that defied expectation. Mastery was not measured by victory, applause, or spectacle. It was measured by the indelible recognition of authority, and by the way subtle demonstration could reshape perception and understanding. In the stillness that followed, the room, and all who were part of it, absorbed the lesson. Years later, when the story was told, it retained the same calm inevitability. Bruce Lee had moved, the fight had ended in seconds, and the quiet legacy of mastery had been cemented. Not in force, not in noise, but in the enduring silence of skill applied with precision.